Right then. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity, Mike. I do appreciate it. And today I'm going to talk about what can be learned from the UK response to the coronavirus using STAMP and how this learning could shape future responses and policies. And the previous talk by Harold was very interesting because there's a lot of issues that he's highlighted that are evident in some of the stuff that I've been doing. But I won't go into the detail of that today. I'll be talking about some other topics, but it is a huge opportunity to put a positive spin on it. So before I begin, I just want to give a quick sort of context from a perspective of accident causality, because I'm sure that there are a number of people in the room that are familiar with STAMP and the principles that it's based upon, but there'll be some that probably aren't. So I just want to give an opportunity there to sort of bridge that gap, put a bit of a stepping stone in there. So you all must be familiar, surely, assuming and presuming that you're familiar with Professor James Reason's world-famous Swiss cheese model. And the context is we have some hazards, some things that are potentially harmful, and we want to protect our people and assets from those by putting defences in depth, but recognising that there's potentially some holes in those defences, and that's the reality we have to manage, we have to live with. Now, some of you who are on Twitter may be familiar with this diagram. This is a COVID-19 pandemic version of the Swiss cheese model created by a chap called Ian McKay from Australia. And what he's done here is really, really nicely pictorially represented some of the personal responsibilities that each of us as individuals have with regards to our own health and safety, but also of those around us, and then also shared responsibilities. So we've got the typical social distancing, self-isolation, masks, hand hygiene, whether you touch your face a lot, which I do, I apologise. If you're in crowded areas, limit your time at risk. Some fast and sensitive testing and tracing, tracking and tracing, ventilation, air filtration, government messaging and financial support, quarantine and isolation, and of course vaccines. And the chap has really well highlighted some of the holes in that Swiss cheese, and also highlighted this little mouse you can see there, which is representing a lot of the information that's out there that's not necessarily factually correct and is potentially eroding some of those barriers due to personal behaviours. Now, what I want to sort of emphasize is that's a good starting point, but if you want to get into the real detail and get some real value from assessing these systems and making improvements using STAMP, we have to think more broadly than just Swiss cheese and linear direct causality. So for those of you who are not familiar, STAMP is an acronym that refers to Systems Theoretic Accident Model and some analysis and design processes built upon that foundation, upon that model. And I'm going to give you a little bit of detail to that now. So the core concept, much like Swiss cheese is to linear direct causality, this is essentially the core concept to STAMP. Any STAMP-based analysis is based around this concept, which is a closed loop feedback control. So essentially we have some kind of process that we want to control, or hazard or situation, and conceptually we put a controller in control of that process, and we enable that controller and empower that controller to be able to influence that process through some form of control actions. Now, they could be direct control or they could be indirect control, depending on the specific thing that you're looking at. But conceptually, what we're trying to do is control that process with some control actions. Now, the behavior of that controller is defined by what we call a control algorithm. And essentially what that is just a royal label for a lot of different behaviors that controller can exhibit and the type of control actions or style of control actions that it can issue. Now, of course, it's also got what's called a process model or mental model if we're talking about a human controller. And again, that is just a representation of the control process, the state of the process, how it's changing, and that is updated by some feedback from the process. And fundamentally, this is the core concept of STAMP. Now, when we're talking about control actions, there are generally four types: 4 contributory, 4 unsafe control actions. We've got a control action that's not provided, a control action that is provided that is unsafe, anything to do with timing and sequencing of those control actions, and then also to do with duration. Now, when we're talking about control conceptually, very high concept, what are we actually talking about? Well, when we're talking in the context of the pandemic, one of the main things that needs to be controlled, and I'm using square brackets there because I'm just emphasizing that the word control can mean many things to many people. And what I'm trying to emphasize is I'm being sort of generic. We are trying to influence a process. We're trying to control that process for a positive benefit. And so what do we need to do? Well, bluntly, we need to control the population's behavior in some shape or form. We need to control the resource load or pressure. When I say resource, I'm talking about healthcare, transportation, logistics, availability of materials. We need to clearly control the virus transmission. We need to control its treatment. We control its mutation, and also medical treatment medical treatment itself, not necessarily related to the virus and the treatment of virus symptoms, but generally the reason a healthcare system exists is to provide medical treatment, whether it's planned or unplanned or emergencies. And of course, we shouldn't, in theory, have any disturbance or disruption of that if we're trying to deal with a virus, but that's not necessarily what's happening. So when we're talking about hierarchical control structures, this is essentially an arrangement of these control loops to perform a particular function or mission. So if we're talking about controlling the virus, we'll have different control loops that interact to deal with that specific function. But if we're talking about controlling the behavior of the population, we'll have a slightly different control structure that may have some common parts at different parts of the hierarchy. Now, this is just a very high level basic control structure model that I just want to emphasize some points here. So when we're talking about control, really we want to think about the entire system life cycle conceptually. Now, when we're talking about healthcare, typically we're talking about day-to-day operations, maintenance or support to those operations, response and recovery if something dangerous happens or something bad happens. And then in terms of design, it's generally design of the procedures that are going to be applied or the processes that are going to be applied in the context of treating the virus or changing the way the hospital operates to deal with hot and cold areas where the virus is potentially present and where it should not be present. Now, I generally call that working in the business. So this is operations. This is generally what we do on a day-to-day basis, and we're dealing with the here and now or the immediate future. Now, what we can also do is take a step back and think about the design or strategy of this organization. So what I call working on the business. So thinking about what's happening on the horizon. You know, there's a potential risk for a pandemic. What does that mean for our response? What does that mean for our workload, our resourcing, how many people we need? You know, all of those, stockpile information, for example. And so what I'm trying to emphasize here is any organization that is doing the day job, working in the business, there is also an important aspect of working on the business, thinking strategically, preparing for the future, doing risk assessments. And those two controllers, design and operations, are present in the organization management and should get appropriate resource and support to make sure that this process down here is actually going to be able to achieve its mission and do so safely. Now, this on the outside here on the right-hand side, I'm just emphasizing here the closed loop feedback. So we have some system and some system safety engineers assessing that organization and the organization management, understanding what challenges there are and how to overcome them, and providing that feedback to the organization management so they can evolve their operations or perhaps change the design of their operations to suit whatever mission challenges they have. So just to sort of emphasize that, instead of Swiss cheese, I want to implant in your mind that we're talking about jigsaw puzzles. So the control loops are the puzzle pieces, and we are looking to see how they fit together in the context of a control structure, which is the jigsaw puzzle. So let's talk about the response overview and the control structure model itself. So you'll all be familiar with these graphs, I'm sure by now, seeing them every day. On the left-hand side, we've got the UK daily cases, which was updated this morning, and then the UK unfortunate daily deaths. Now, the things I've highlighted here are the lockdowns, so lockdown 1, 2, and 3. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is because in the context of applying control to transmission of the virus and to the behavior of the population, the lockdown, or lockdowns, should I say, were necessary control actions by the government to try and control the virus, control the behavior of the population. And you can see the response of that control system. The first lockdown essentially extended quite a period of time, and that helped to flatten the curve. And then towards September, October time, it started to rise. And so another lockdown was initiated, which helped to flatten the curve somewhat. But then again, in the approach to the end of November over Christmas, it climbed again. So clearly the control algorithm for instituting lockdowns needs to be optimized. Okay, so transmission and population behavior, non-COVID-19. So when I say population behavior, non-COVID-19, I'm referring to people that are not ill or have COVID-19, but they do have other medical issues, either ongoing medical issues or requiring operations and such like, or they have emergency conditions or emerging issues that would get worse if they didn't get medical attention. So this is a very high-level control structure model. Some of you may have seen this in one of my YouTube videos from last year. This is just a picture of it. Essentially what I'm doing here is just showing a very high-level abstract view of the control structure of the general public and the people that are subject to coronavirus. So we've got the patient, we've got a medical team, we've got the medical coordination. So this is a very high-level conceptual description of the controller of the medical aspects. We've got other medical teams that are dealing with other patients that are sharing experience and knowledge as they gain it about the virus and about how it affects the body and how to treat it. We've got the government society coordination across the top, again, very high level. And then down the left-hand side, we've got the direct control actions of the government on the general population, the general public. So in this case, lockdown, the instruction to be in lockdown. And then, of course, what I mentioned, the control algorithm, the behaviors and the mental model, the beliefs of those individuals. Now, when we're talking about the lockdown control actions, we're talking about the provision, in this case, of some materials, marketing communications, not marketing communications, emergency communications, where we are telling the population to stay at home, save lives, protect the NHS. And of course, everybody wants to do that. You know, they don't want people to die. They don't want to affect the NHS. And for some people, it's really convenient to stay at home if they're getting paid. But for others, it's not. They need to be out working. You know, they'll lose their businesses, lose their livelihoods. And that's really bad. So you can see there's a setting up of tension in the general population, in the public, from that control action from the government. Then later on, the messaging changed to stay alert as they started to release the first lockdown, to stay alert, save lives, control the virus. Now, there was a lot of conversation about some of this messaging, saying that it was confusing to the population. And there was a lot of media interest in this, a lot of conversation, which actually potentially interferes or disrupts the ability of the government or other organizations to take appropriate timely action dealing with questions that are not necessarily in the best public interest or in safety interest. So here are some more messages. So stay at home. You can only go out for a permitted reason. The police can take action against you. A step too close could be a step too far. So again, this kind of messaging is even stronger. And for those people that want to protect the NHS, don't want to bother other people if they're starting to feel ill or, you know, they've got pains, they need to go and get diagnosed for something, and they're not going to the hospital for these, you know, very, very valid reasons. These control actions could be judged to be unsafe control actions given the context of individuals in the population. So there is some really interesting dynamics and consideration associated with the messaging and the control actions from authorities and the healthcare system. So then this is a more detailed, slightly high level control structure model. And what I want to emphasize here is consideration of medical treatment, viruses and of the virus and its symptoms the medical treatment planned an emergency, but also the social care aspects. So these are adults or individuals out in the open that are not necessarily subject to medical care, but are vulnerable and require appropriate support, and are especially vulnerable to the coronavirus. Now, the control actions of the government and the healthcare system was very much to essentially leave this part to its own devices, wind it down, and reallocate resources to the medical treatment of viruses and symptoms of the virus and the symptoms itself. You might argue that some of those are unsafe control actions, but there's no information available at the moment that allows me to be able to make any judgments or make any observations on what the algorithm, what the decision making of the government entities were, and why they believe that that was an appropriate thing to do, given the potential impact on these things. Now, in the context of medical research, system treatments and vaccines, there was a clear leadership during the summer last year from the government to hedge the bets, get as many vaccines in development as possible, get them all pre-ordered, and that's potentially saved many more lives than would have been the case had they stuck with, for example, the European approach to acquiring the vaccines. Right, yes. So let's look at some more detail then. So let's focus on the track and change aspects. So there was a track and trace system developed and put into service during the summer, which had some level of success in the early days. But as the transmission rate increased, the effectiveness and capability of the NHS track and trace system, and I've spelt that wrong, I apologise, actually became irrelevant, because as more cases occur, the less important and effective the track and trace system is. So it's only sort of a steam relief valve. It's not a major mitigation in this case. But the government recognised the challenges with the track and trace system, and it was introduced a new organisation, the National Institute for Health Protection. They were, put together as being an organisation to take care of track and trace and help deal with some of those issues. But that organisation isn't going to come online until the early part of this year. So that organisational change was recommended, but it didn't actually, or hasn't actually occurred just yet. But in principle, that should improve the capability and scalability of the track and trace system, which will help to reduce the transmission rate of the virus. Now, one of the other things to emphasise, which is really important, is the mutation of the virus. Because all the time that there are a lot of people infected, high infection rate, and a lot of people infected, there are significant opportunities for the virus to mutate. And if the virus mutates, not only does that mean that potentially the vaccines don't work, but also your strategy and the things that you've been doing up to now don't work anymore, and you may have to take more stringent, more significant action, such as a complete lockdown. And with the increase in social media, alternative media, and discussions about conspiracy theories, that's actually affecting the mental models and algorithms of the general public. And of course, being confined to your own home for a long time is not good for people's mental health, but that can affect the way that they will react or respond to appropriate control actions from the government authorities. So just finally, another Twitter note. So this is a tweet from a chap called Mike Graham. I don't really know too much about Mike, but I know he's quite a vocal person on Twitter about this kind of stuff. And he highlights a news front page article from the Sun newspaper that basically highlights Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, wanting to be free, but SAGE, the government scientific advisory group, won't let them. Now, this is the kind of control actions that the media, the alternative media, social media, are providing to the general population. We need to think about the effects of that on the general population and their behaviour, but also how that affects the people in charge, the people in control. If there's a lot of this political, going on, how does that affect their ability to not only make safe decisions, but also not delay appropriate control actions or take actions that are inappropriate, politically correct, as opposed to necessary for safety? Yes, I've just talked about that. So what I was just going to highlight is the mainstream media, the social media, the alternative media They interact with the general public. The UK government is interacting with the general public. But if the behaviour of these aspects here, bearing in mind that they're out to make as much money as they can from bad headlines and such like, so it's in their interest to try and generate as much kerfuffle as possible. But the impacts of that on the behaviour of the government and the individuals involved is quite significant. Yes. Okay. Right, so final thoughts. Stamp-based analysis focus, as I've highlighted, it focuses on the control structure. So what are the controllers in that structure? How do they interact with each other? How do they influence each other? And then what does that mean for controller behavior and interactions? So we spoke about the general population and their behavior. We talked about the government issuing control actions to lock people down. But the main thing to sort of highlight as well is this goes beyond failures and faults. It includes dangerous successes. It also allows us to look at things without necessarily being seduced by hindsight bias. Because of course, in the early days of this, this pandemic, there was a lot of conversations about starting the lockdown too late. It's a week late, that's cost lots of lives. But then later down the line, with the case of the vaccines, the decision not to go down the line with the European Medicines Agency and the European Union to get the vaccines ordered, that's actually transpired to be a positive thing. But ultimately, you can model all of those things using this approach and find some very interesting things to consider. Now, from my perspective, I think that the stamp-based approaches provide a massive opportunity because they allow you to look at these aspects specifically, either at the time that they're going on or more beneficially earlier on. Before we have the next pandemic, we could use the stamp-based approach to model what that control structure should look like and then make sure it's appropriately resourced. So there we go. What questions do you have? Questions and answers.
Right, okay, yeah, thank you very much, Simon. That was very, very entertaining and very, very appropriate talk, I think. I think we need to think in terms of those control structures, don't we? I've got a couple of questions come through. I think the first one from Rajiv Bangwal was really, would a stamp analysis have highlighted the issues of the Microsoft Excel data exchange, the track and trace data that was lost?
Let's have a look at the track and trace, shall we?
Would it have found that?
There we go. So there's the NHS track and trace element in the control structure. Now, I've modeled it based on the information I've had available, where the NHS track and trace, not trace and trace, provides information for the medical research system, so looking at the treatments and the vaccines, but it also provides information to medical treatment. And then, of course, it provides a critical control action to the general public to control the transmission of the virus. If this control action, self-isolate is not provided, I'll go back to the control action guide words. This one. If the control action from track and trace to self-isolate is not provided, is that a safety-related outcome? Well, it is if they're infected. If they're not infected, then that's a potentially unwanted outcome in the impact upon the economy or that individual's life. So it's absolutely fundamental that that control action is provided at the right time and not provided spuriously. In the context of exchanging information, let's just go back to the diagram. Too many slides. Yeah, so in the context of providing information to others and reporting information up to Public Health England for onward communication up to the government, in terms of, this is the number of people, the number of cases. If that information is provided up the control structure inappropriately, that means that the mental model, the process model of these higher level controllers may be inadequate or deficient, which means that they won't react in time. So if we go back to this picture, so if, for example, the track and trace system is not telling the government, the decision makers early enough that this thing is climbing, they're not going to be able to take timely action. And when they do realize it's wrong, they have to take significant action to try and counteract it quicker, potentially more painful control actions. And obviously, the more painful control actions that are issued, the less likely the general public are going to respond to that in the future. And that also sort of highlights the point I made about media and the part that the media play in this. So if the media are playing games like this and, you know, making money out of bad news, what effect does that have on the mental model of the general public? Do they believe that the people running track and trace are stupid, or that the government is incompetent? And if they do, does that mean they're less likely to trust or fulfill the control actions that are provided to them in the future? And what knock-on effect does that have on the virus transmission and propagation? So I'm hoping you can see it is a feedback loop in various manifestations, but also from a dynamics perspective. If they underestimate the cases and do not take appropriate action, you end up with an escalating problem, as you can see there. And this was in the run-up to Christmas, when the government was talking about what they're going to do strategy over Christmas period, such as the number of people in the social bubbles, households that could go meet for 5 days. Then it was reduced to 1 day. And then before Christmas, it was, Southeast England, London, nobody's allowed to go around for Christmas. So you can see how that, delay of information or issues with following control actions can contribute to an exponential increase in the virus rate. Now, playing this quite dark, you can see how the first, second and third peaks have escalated. Is there a suggestion there that the fourth wave is going to be, somewhere over the top?
Oh my God.
Is that something that perhaps we should be talking about? Because ultimately, what I'm talking about here is the control algorithm of the government and the mental model, the process model that they have. And if they don't have appropriate sensory feedback to allow them to take appropriate timely action, then the only outcome is an exponential increase in devastation and everything else. I don't mean to paint a really dark picture, but it is just literally control loops and dynamics we're talking about. Any other questions?
Well,
what other questions?
Yeah. There's another one from Harold, actually. So he says, you're using STAMP brilliantly to describe stuff, but how does it provide insights to proactively handling the pandemic? In other words, I suppose, how does it suggest additional things you might need to do? What are we missing? What controls need fixing?
Okay. Well, the first one already highlighted by Ranjiv is to do with track and trace. So track and trace is clearly a absolutely fundamental part of the control feedback loop for the ability of the government to know what's going on and take appropriate action. So that's the first thing, highlighting that the track and, well, I haven't, but I'm just emphasizing the point here because they've already made the recommendation for change. The NHS track and trace function was designed and implemented in a very short space of time about here in the early days. But as the peak started to climb, it was overwhelmed and so became irrelevant. It was a non-functional sensor in the feedback loop. And so without that important feedback, the only control action we can really have is a full-on lockdown. And then over time, as the capability of track and trace increased, that gives us more room in the dynamics of the feedback loop. But again, it's such an important part of that sensory feedback loop that if it's not robust, properly resourced, gets back to people, responds to the general public quickly enough, then that can contribute to an escalating situation. Another example is to do with the police service. So the police service were empowered with the ability to issue fines to people. But there was a lot of conversation in the alternate media, social media, about whether these things were actually lawful or not, which is a fair conversation to have. But it's important to recognise that those kind of conversations that are going on and the ability